How can web science, personalization connect to knowledge graphs? Web3 is one example with Solid built on a knowledge graph, but what else are the possibilities maybe that exist right now?
These are great questions. And so this is where we get sort of slightly out of my territory, although, you know, like I did a lot of talking and learning, especially at the conference back in May. That was super awesome for kind of being a bit more of a, having spent some time learning a bit by osmosis and just overhearing conversations. I was actually in a conversation. And certainly, so in the context of healthcare and personalization, which is where I was very focused in the Knowledge Graphs conference, we got into this conversation and there were some really interesting ideas in terms of how you can use that data really effectively. So like Deborah McGuinness was in the workshop, which was awesome. And she was talking about effectively that thing about how you might examine outcomes or decision paths in the context of, let's say we've got my app for the patients who've got their kidney disease, of being able to do the, you know, oh, well, people who were like you tended to select this type of dialysis and that went really well for them. Like those kinds of like the Amazon style, you know, people like, we want this. So that was one very practical example of how this technology might be applied for recommender systems. But beyond that, I would really love, I don't know if Francois is able to speak at this moment as our resident expert for today's coffee chat, but I would love to hear some thoughts from folks deeper in the knowledge graph community.
Hopefully he can join.
Maybe,
that would be fun.
He may be, maybe on some other thing as well, though.
I'll do my best until if and when he can speak. So one thing that came to mind with Matei's comments just a minute ago is, you know, customer 360, right? So it's this idea of being able to see, mostly from within the enterprise, all the exchanges that you have with your customer across channels. But it seems to me, and I don't know if this is just making things up or if there's technology that can support this, but it seems to me that with Solid, if we kind of transitioned into a personalized base, there would be, I mean, that is kind of already a 360 placement. And that can then be connected to all of these other, you know, apps that we use, like healthcare apps or Twitter or whatever.
Just to ask a stupid question, when you say 360, what do you mean exactly?
Oh, okay. So this is based on, like, imagine that you have a knowledge graph entity node and customer's name, right? So Clare Hooper. And let's say, you know, you're talking to an insurance company and maybe you have a policy with them for your car and they've sent you, you know, 17 letters in the mail for other products and you've engaged with that, you know, maybe you call and you have an issue with one thing, right? So, or even potentially they have other data on you, like for instance, your claim history, or if it's medical insurance, like your actual like health records and things like that. So it's the idea of using a knowledge graph to centralize all of those data pieces so that you can actually see what is our relationship? What is the relationship of this company with Clare Hooper? Because that context, like, because basically you know that context, but they don't, right? So that's sort of where, you know, you get a lot of weird, uncoordinated messages from major corporations that aren't very pleasant a lot of the time. And that's one way that, you know, that's one thing that they want to address, but there's, and I don't know if this is just my naivete, but it seems that there's a lot of like, there's an obvious like self-evidentness that this is a good thing, but knowing exactly what you can do with it when you then have that kind of data, I think that's less clear for
back to informed consent.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, no, that's super helpful, thank you. It also makes me think about, so in the past I have had conversations about things like, so in the context of healthcare, the EMR, the electronic medical record, which, you know, gets talked about at various levels all the time. Like in the UK, there's a lot of talk about kind of how the NHS was going to manage that and kind of integrate records as opposed to having the paper records at separate places. And obviously it's very powerful if you can have an individual's health records all in one place. But then if you start to look at how you might hook that up to like apps or things like that, then again, you start to get into some very treacherous waters very quickly. In terms of kind of informed consent and people understanding how their data might be used, especially if it's in the context of, so let's say I've got some health condition that I'm managing. My health records are in some country system someplace, right? And then someone offers me an app to help manage whatever. And I'm like, okay, great, yeah, sure. And I just tap along through. And that gets access to my records, and that's fine because we've got things like HIPAA compliance or the GDPR or whatever, there's all sorts of standards and whatnot, right? So I'm not, not to say it's completely unregulated and a complete like cowboy land or whatever. But then I also just think that, we see again and again, people don't really understand when they're clicking through. And I do still, not in any way to cast aspersions on sort of the excellent work of Lucia Chen, who is extremely aware of the ethical implications of passive data collection to detect stigmatized mental health conditions. But we can do that kind of thing, right? And not everyone will have that ethical hat on, as it were. And we all know that as data aggregates and accumulates, the analysis you can do with it and the power increases. So I remember one of the very first web science type things I learned about was a seminar at the University of Southampton. I might even have still been an undergraduate, or maybe I was in the very first year of my doctorate. And someone had done some really early analysis. I don't even know if it was of Facebook, because Facebook was real small back then, but someone had done an analysis of a social network, and it was to do with disclosure of homosexuality. And it was basically like, whether you disclose or not, you can infer very accurately whether someone is homosexual from their graph of friends, right? It's the security is as weakest link. And it's just such a depth of kind of messiness that we obviously we talk about it and we try and make sense of it, but it's yet to kind of percolate into the greater system. And I don't think we can ask corporations, we can't ask the Facebook and Google of the world to deal with it, because they are not that mechanism. It is their job to go make money and report to their board and increase their, their profits and stuff. So we need some kind of regulation or legislation, but there's also evidence that legislation isn't great at this either. So sorry, you've set me off now. But there's one more paper I'll mention was at Web Science this year, and I don't remember the names of the authors, but if you're interested, you can ping me on the Slack and I will find it for you. They did this really interesting analysis of YouTube content in terms of personalization. So going back again to that theme, and they basically generated a bunch of fake accounts for kids. And they had those fake accounts kind of watching YouTube videos, and they were checking what the ads were that were displayed to the kids, right? And they did this in 2 different countries. I think one was Canada, and I forget the other, it was a while ago. There was a lot of talks at the conference. 2 different countries, ads for kids. They analysed what the legislation was for those 2 different countries, and these kids were getting adverts for beer and for fast food, which was not legal, and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, so A, this is super upsetting anyway, obviously, but B, is legislation the right tool here? What is the right tool? So there's some huge questions about how do you actually, what is the right mechanism here to play into this space? And again, I do not know the answer. Like, I used to think it was legislation, but I'm starting to question that.